It was just past dawn when Emily Holloway unlocked the gate to Whispering Pines Nature Reserve. The morning mist still clung to the earth, curling gently around the roots of pine trees and drifting across the quiet trails. Emily, the lead park ranger for the past 6 years, took a deep breath and felt the crispness of the air fill her lungs. Mornings like this always felt peaceful, like the forest was still waking up. She started her usual routine, checking the perimeter fence, inspecting the visitor station, scanning for signs of animal activity, but something odd caught her eye near the path. A small figure was sitting motionless on the edge of the trail, just past a bed of wildflowers. At first, she assumed it was a house cat someone had abandoned. But as she stepped closer, her steps slowed. It wasn't a domestic cat. It was a Bobcat Cub, tiny, with oversized paws and large blue eyes that stared straight at her. Its ears twitched, but it didn't move away or try to hide. Emily stopped a few feet away, lowering herself into a crouch so as not to seem threatening. The cub looked exhausted. Its fur was slightly matted from dew, and its little chest rose and fell rapidly. Still, it didn't seem scared, just sat there, watching her as if waiting. Emily's heart tugged in her chest. She had studied wildlife behavior for years, and something about this wasn't right. Bobcat cubs never wandered alone like this, especially not so close to a human. Its presence here was a silent alarm bell. Gently, Emily spoke. "Hey there, little one. Where's your mom?" The cub blinked slowly, then let out a soft mewl, long and high-pitched, more like a plea than a cry. Without warning, it stood, turned, and began walking toward the trees. A few steps in, it paused and looked back over its shoulder, directly at Emily. It wanted her to follow. Emily hesitated only a second before grabbing her satchel and stepping carefully after it. She radioed the station, letting them know she'd be off trail for a short while, possibly tracking an animal in distress. Then she followed the tiny guide into the woods. The cub moved with surprising confidence through the underbrush. Emily followed closely, her boots brushing against ferns and fallen leaves. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. Sunlight peeked through the canopy in patches, lighting their path like a spotlight on nature's stage. She saw signs of bobcat territory, scratches on bark, tracks in soft earth, but no immediate danger. The cub kept glancing back, as if checking to see if she was still there. After almost 15 minutes of winding through dense growth, the cub stopped. There, tucked beneath a fallen log and a patch of low ferns, was a full-grown female bobcat. The mother. Her body was curled tightly, sides rising and falling shallowly. Her eyes barely opened and her head rested against the mossy ground. She looked weak-sick, not injured, and completely still, save for the effort it took her to breathe. The cub moved closer to her, pressing against her side with small, affectionate nudges. Emily stood a respectful distance away, quietly observing, her heart now fully in her throat. The scene was powerful, raw, but tender. The cub hadn't just wandered off, it had come for help. Emily didn't delay. She reached into her satchel for her radio and called the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center with calm urgency. She described the mother's condition, location, and situation. The cub remained nestled against the mother, letting out occasional mews that sounded more like encouragement than panic. As Emily waited for the rescue team to arrive, she sat nearby, quietly whispering words she knew they wouldn't understand, but hoped might be comforting anyway. In her years as a ranger, she had seen wild animals in need, but she had never, not once, been asked, almost invited to help by one of their own. This was not just a lost cub. This was something far more extraordinary. Emily didn't move far from where the cub had stopped. She kept a few steps of respectful distance, but stayed close enough to see the mother bobcat's slow, unsteady breathing. Every few minutes, the cub would nuzzle her face, then glance at Emily as though silently urging her to do something. It was an unspoken trust, a quiet bridge between the wild and the human world. Within 25 minutes, the gentle hum of an all-terrain vehicle approached through the forest. Emily stood and waved as a small team from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center arrived. Dr. Marla Jennings, Soft-spoken veterinarian with years of experience in field rescues stepped down from the vehicle and joined Emily at the scene. Emily gave a quick but detailed summary. She's alert. Barely. No visible wounds, but she's weak. The cub brought me here. Marla looked at the cub, who remained nestled close to its mother, then back at Emily. It led you? That's incredible. With practiced care, the team approached the Bobcat family. They worked calmly and without sudden movement. First, they set down a soft-lined animal crate nearby and opened it wide. Then Marla knelt slowly, holding out a towel and wearing a gentle expression. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. The cub growled faintly, more from instinct than aggression, but didn't leave its mother's side. Marla reached out and gently examined the mother's limbs. No fractures, no bite marks. Her gums, however, were pale. She looked dehydrated and dazed, possibly poisoned or ill from something she had eaten or drunk. The decision was made quickly. They needed to bring her in. The cub was gently lifted first and placed into a smaller carrier lined with soft cloth and leaves. It yowled in protest but didn't resist much. Then, with care and teamwork, the mother was wrapped in a soft blanket and lifted into the larger crate. Emily stayed with them the whole time, kneeling down to watch the cub through the crate bars. "You did well," she said softly. "You did better than most would have." As the team made their way back toward the rescue vehicle, Emily walked behind them, still in disbelief. The cub had found her, trusted her, and let her hear something almost unheard of in her line of work. Wild animals, especially ones as shy as bobcats, didn't seek out people. Back at the wildlife center, the medical staff began immediate treatment. Fluids, nutrients, and blood samples were administered to the mother bobcat, who lay still but responsive. They named her Luna. The cub was temporarily called Scout. Scout refused to be far from Luna's enclosure. Even when food was offered, he would only eat once he saw his mother was resting peacefully. Staff watched the pair with quiet reverence. Some of them had seen bonds between wild animals before, but this one was different. Scout wasn't just depending on his mother, he was watching over her, actively staying near her side like a small protector. Emily visited them every day after her shift. She'd sit on the other side of the glass and talk to Scout, who had grown used to her presence. When she wasn't there, he paced a little more. It was as if he remembered what she'd done, and in his own way, he trusted her now. Marla later confirmed what they had suspected. Luna had likely drunk from a stagnant pool filled with decaying organic matter, a natural source of toxins. It wasn't uncommon in the dry season when animals became desperate for water. Thankfully, with early intervention, Luna's chances of recovery were strong, but no one stopped talking about how she was found. Everyone agreed, if Scout hadn't come for help, his mother wouldn't have survived the day. It was as if he'd understood that someone might be able to help, and he'd chosen Emily. Back at the reserve, word spread among the staff and volunteers. The story wasn't just touching hearts, it was changing how people saw the wild animals they worked so hard to protect. Luna's recovery over the next week was slow but steady. If fluids helped, the rest helped more. But what truly seemed to lift her was the constant presence of Scout. The little cub hardly left her side, curling into the crook of her belly each night and waking whenever she stirred. Staff at the wildlife center took shifts, monitoring them through quiet observation windows. Though the animals weren't kept in public enclosures, nearly everyone, veterinarians, volunteers, and interns, found themselves drawn to their room like moths to a flame. Scout became a quiet hero at the center. He was small, curious, and highly alert. He never lashed out or acted aggressively. He watched everything: the hands that brought food, the gentle movements of the staff, and the daily routines. Amali came by whenever she could, and Scout always seemed to brighten when she entered the room. He'd lift his head, flick his ears, and follow her with his gaze as she spoke gently to both of them through the glass. It wasn't typical behavior for a wild animal, especially a bobcat. Dr. Marla Jennings brought it up during a staff meeting. "There's something different about this cub," she said thoughtfully. "It's not that he's tame, he's wild, but he's aware in a way most animals aren't at this age. He's protective, observant, and he trusted someone enough to get help. That idea stuck with the team. Scout hadn't just cried for help, he'd led a stranger deep into the woods, to unknown territory, and trusted her to act. It wasn't just instinct. It was choice. By day 10, Luna was walking short distances again. Though still weak, she began eating on her own. The staff slowly introduced enrichment activities to encourage her natural behaviors, hiding food, providing logs to scratch, simulating small prey movement. Scout was eager to participate, pouncing at feathers and wrestling soft logs like a true hunter in training. But he never strayed far from his mother. Emily began documenting their behavior more formally. She had started a file simply titled Scout and Luna, and every entry she wrote surprised her. She noted how Scout adjusted his pace to walk beside Luna, how he waited for her to finish eating before eating himself, how he sometimes brought small objects, leaves, feathers, even twigs, and left them near her, almost like offerings. Word of their story began to spread beyond the reserve. A local journalist visited the center after hearing a brief mention of it on a radio segment. The piece she wrote for the town paper featured a photo of Scout sitting beside Luna, with the headline, "Tiny Cub's Brave Act Saves His Mother." The article was shared widely, and in the following days, the center received dozens of letters, donations, and even paintings from children moved by the story. People weren't just interested, they were inspired. Many wanted to know more. Who was the ranger who followed the cub? What happened to the mother? How could they help protect wildlife like this in their own towns? Emily, still modest by nature, hesitated to step into the spotlight, but she agreed to speak at a small community event hosted at the Reserve's Learning Center. There, standing in front of a group of students and families, she told the story of how Scout had found her, how he hadn't run, but led, how his courage reminded her why she chose this path in the first place. "He didn't know me," she said, "but somehow he knew I could help. And that trust, well, it changed everything." As she spoke, people listened quietly, their eyes wide with wonder, and just like that, Scout's story had done more than bring help to his mother. It had begun to change how people saw the animals living just beyond the edges of their own neighborhoods. 2 weeks after their arrival, Luna and Scout were no longer just guests at the Wildlife Center. They were its heart. Staff and volunteers often gathered during breaks to quietly observe them. The mother's strength was returning, slowly but steadily. She walked without limping now, and had begun responding to environmental enrichment with more curiosity. But what kept people coming back wasn't just her recovery. It was the unmistakable bond between mother and cubs, something that felt deeper than instinct. Scout continued to stay close. He didn't behave like a frightened baby clinging for safety. Instead, he watched over Luna with a sense of calm purpose. If she rested, he nestled beside her. If she stirred, he stood alert. Whenever food arrived, Scout would touch her muzzle gently before eating, as if making sure she was ready. Even experienced staff members found themselves quietly moved by the relationship. There's something special about them. One intern whispered to another while observing their enclosure, "It's like he's not just her cub, he's her guardian." Emily, who continued to visit daily, had started writing short journal entries about them, her own reflections. In one, she wrote, "We think animals act only on survival, but today, Scout stayed beside Luna as she rested in the sun, paw on her shoulder, head tilted. I swear it looked like love. Real love, not instinct." Outside the center, the community's interest was growing. The article from the local newspaper had caught the attention of a regional news station. Short television segment aired, showing brief footage of Scout and Luna behind the protective glass. The narrator told the story with simple, heartfelt words. How a wild cub had emerged from the forest, not to run, but to ask for help, and how that moment sparked something much bigger than a rescue. Within days, letters and emails poured in from across the state. A nearby school organized a wildlife fundraiser and named their science fair theme The Call of the Wild. Children dressed up as forest animals and made posters about bobcats and environmental care. Several drew Scout and Luna from the photo in the paper. Donations to the Wildlife Center increased significantly. That unexpected support, The center's director proposed something they'd long dreamed of, a fully reconstructed natural rehabilitation enclosure, one designed not just for safety, but to help recovering animals experience a habitat closer to the wild. They called it the Healing Grove, and Scout and Luna would be its first residents. Emily walked the grounds as construction began. The grove would be shaded by tall trees and dotted with rocks, bushes, and small streams. It was carefully fenced for protection, but it would allow Luna to regain her strength naturally and prepare both her and Scout for life beyond the center. Dr. Marla was pleased. This space will help Luna relearn what her instincts already know. And Scout, well, he's going to thrive. Scout, meanwhile, continued to show signs of deep intelligence. He responded to environmental cues faster than any cub they'd seen. He had figured out the automatic feeding platform in 2 days, tracked simulated prey toys with precision, and even began mimicking his mother's scent-marking behaviors. A sign. He was beginning to think of the environment as his own. Despite the growing public interest, the center was careful not to commercialize the story. There were no t-shirts or branded merchandise. Focus remained where it started, on trust, protection, and healing. As the Healing Grove neared completion, Emily stood at the edge of their enclosure one afternoon. Luna was sunbathing on a flat, rock eyes half closed, while Scout sat alert beside her, watching the wind ripple through the trees. It wasn't just survival that kept them strong. It was something more, something quieter, something that, in a world full of noise and hurry, reminded everyone watching that love real. Wordless love can exist even in the heart of the wild. The Healing Grove opened quietly on a warm spring morning. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no press event. Only a few staff members, including Emily and Dr. Marla, gathered outside the new enclosure as Luna and Scout were gently released into their new temporary home. The grove stretched wide, filled with tall grass, native shrubs, a shaded creek, and plenty of space to climb and hide. As soon as Luna stepped out of the crate, she paused and sniffed the air. The sun hit her fur in golden patches as she surveyed the space cautiously. Scout trotted out right after, more eager than cautious, bounding over a low rock and stopping by the creek to look at his reflection. It was the first time either of them had been outside a building in weeks. The transition went smoother than anyone expected. Luna adapted quickly, returning to natural patterns marking territory, stalking through underbrush, and finding shaded areas to rest. Scout, true to form, was both playful and observant. He followed his mother but also explored independently, his body language showing curiosity rather than fear. The enclosure had been built with intention, hidden platforms, safe climbing spots, scent trails, and live camera feeds that allowed the staff to monitor behavior without intrusion. What they saw was reassuring. "They're almost ready," Marla said to Emily after reviewing footage that evening. "If all continues like this, I think we can begin preparing for their release into the wild within the next few weeks." Emily nodded, but she felt a small ache in her chest. She was proud. She was thrilled, actually. But a part of her already missed them. Outside of the center, the story had continued to grow. Scout and Luna had become quiet ambassadors for something much larger than themselves. Environmental educators used their story as an example of interdependence between humans and wildlife. Schools invited rangers and biologists to speak to children about native species. A short documentary film crew asked permission to create a feature called The Cub Who Came Calling. The center had never seen this kind of attention before, but they didn't seek fame. They remained focused on their mission: care, rehabilitate, release. Still, there was something deeply touching about how this story had reached people. A couple from 3 towns over visited the center and quietly handed over an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a check. "We lost our daughter last year. She loved wild animals, especially cats. We read about Scout and Luna, and, well, it gave us something to feel hopeful about again." The staff didn't speak much after that, but their eyes said everything. Another woman drove for hours just to leave a wooden sculpture of a Bobcat Cub at the center's gate. A retired biology teacher sent in a letter offering to volunteer, and a local artist donated murals. For the educational wing, All of them said the same thing. This story reminded them that compassion didn't have boundaries, not between people, and not between species. Emily began keeping a journal not just for her own thoughts, but to track every letter, visit, and donations sparked by Scout and Luna. She titled the growing collection Echoes of the Grove. One afternoon, she stood just outside the healing grove as Scout chased a butterfly through tall grass. Luna was nearby, perched on a log, watching her cub with the steady gaze of a mother who had known pain on now. Peace. Emily smiled to herself. What had started with a cry in the woods had turned into a ripple that touched people from places she'd never even heard of. Cub's quiet plea had brought strangers together, reminded them of their place in nature, and inspired them to protect something far beyond themselves. And it all began because one tiny bobcat dared to trust. By the third week inside the healing grove, Luna and Scout had fully settled into their routine. Luna had regained most of her strength and had put on healthy weight. Her movements were fluid, again powerful and precise. Scout, growing quickly, had become a blur of energy. He would dart through the grass, leap across rocks, and splash around in the shallow creek with a joy that seemed endless. Each day, the wildlife team reviewed the camera footage, carefully noting behavior, feeding patterns, and responses to simulated wild stimuli. It wasn't just about observing. It was about preparing. Release was drawing near. Dr. Marla sat with Emily. One afternoon, as they reviewed the footage from the past few days, Scout was now mimicking his mother, almost perfectly hiding, stalking, pouncing, even learning how to climb trees. Luna had resumed marking territory and had begun teaching Scout through subtle nudges and patient repetition. "This is exactly what we hoped for," Marla said. "They're ready to move on soon. We'll just need to find the right spot." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes still on the screen. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere far enough from roads and people." Marla smiled softly. "Somewhere Scout can grow up wild, just like he was meant to." The center began working with local conservation groups to identify the perfect release location, an area protected from development, rich in natural resources, and far from urban noise. They chose a quiet stretch of highland forest, about 30 miles north of the reserve. It was remote, filled with water sources, small prey animals, and plenty of natural cover. A hidden camera already installed nearby had recently captured deer, foxes, and even another bobcat passing through.
Ow.
It was perfect. Meanwhile, Emily continued visiting the healing grove every day. She didn't bring food or supplies anymore; those were handled by the staff. Instead, she came just to watch, quietly leaning against the fence, sometimes speaking in low tones the way she had when Scout first appeared. He often noticed her, even from a distance. He would pause whatever he was doing, glance toward the edge of the enclosure, and twitch his ears. Occasionally, he'd let out a soft, brief chirp, a sound she'd come to recognize as a greeting. Emily had known many animals during her years as a ranger, but this bond, though silent, felt different. She had once found Scout alone, desperate, and pleading. And now she was about to witness him return to where he belonged, strong, wild, and no longer in need. When the release day was finally set, it arrived with the stillness of early morning. There were no spectators, no reporters, just Emily, Dr. Marla, and 2 wildlife transport specialists. The crate containing Luna and Scout was gently loaded into a quiet transport vehicle lined with straw and branches to ease stress. The ride to the release site took nearly an hour. Winding through forest roads and away from the hum, civilization, they reached a clearing just beyond a ridge lined with pine trees. A small freshwater stream sparkled nearby. The team moved in practiced silence. They opened the crate and stepped back. Luna stepped out first, as graceful as ever. She paused, ears alert, eyes scanning the trees. The air was thick with birdsong and the rustle of wind through leaves. Then Scout emerged, larger than when Emily had first seen him, but still with that bright curiosity in his eyes. He looked up at his mother, then around at the vastness before him. And then, just like that, they walked off side by side, disappearing Into the forest, as though they had always belonged there, Emily stood for a long time, listening. There were no goodbyes, no fanfare, just two shadows blending into the trees. Quiet, natural, free. And with them, they carried a story that had already begun changing the world around them. In the weeks after, Luna and Scout returned to the wild. A quiet shift settled over the wildlife center. The enclosure that once housed them now stood empty, but no one could bring themselves to fill it just yet. Staff walked past the healing grove more slowly, pausing sometimes to glance inside, remembering where Luna once lay, recovering, and where. Scout used to leap over the rocks like a spark of energy. Emily still visited it from time to time. She didn't go inside, just stood at the fence, hands in her pockets, letting the wind rustle through her hair. Sometimes she imagined hearing a faint mewl, or catching a glimpse of small golden eyes just beyond the trees. She knew they were going to free, but their presence hadn't left. People still sent letters. A class from another state had turned Scout's story into a reading comprehension activity. A retired ranger sent a hand-drawn map of bobcat sightings, marking possible future safe zones. A children's book illustrator offered to donate sketches for an educational booklet about bobcat conservation, asking only that it include Scout's name on the cover. Something rare had happened. A simple, real moment had quietly changed the way people connected to wildlife. Not through a dramatic rescue or a viral video, but through a story rooted in trust, in loyalty, and quiet courage. And then came something unexpected. One morning, Emily received a package at the ranger station. Inside was a memory book, hand-bound, carefully organized. On the front, pressed into leather, was the title. Because he asked for help. Inside were more than 60 pages of handwritten messages, photos, and artwork from people across the country. Each page was a small testimony. A child who'd written a poem about animals. A family who'd started using reusable containers because we want to help keep the water clean for Luna and Scout. A teenager who said she'd never cared about wildlife until she read their story, and now wanted to be a conservationist. Emily sat at her desk for a long time after flipping through it, the weight of the book resting in her lap. That afternoon, she brought the book to the wildlife center. They placed it near the front desk. On a small wooden stand beside a framed photo of Luna and Scout, visitors began stopping to read it as they entered. Many left with tears in their eyes. Some added small notes of their own, taping them gently to the back cover. The center's director proposed a new initiative, inspired by all the unexpected attention. It would focus on early wildlife education, showing children how to identify animals, understand their behaviors, and most importantly, how to respect their space. The program would be called The Cub's Call, and the pilot launch would take place that summer. Emily offered to lead the first sessions. When she stood before the first group of students in the learning hall, she felt a moment of hesitation. Then, she remembered Scout, how he'd stood so small and silent on that morning trail, asking for help without words. That image gave her confidence. She told the story with warmth and honesty. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't make Scout into a cartoon hero. She simply told it the way it happened. A wild cub who reached out across the line between animal and human, and how that moment opened a door to something far greater. The students listened with wide eyes. Some gasped when she described following him into the forest. Others smiled when she spoke about how he stayed beside his mother during recovery, and when the session ended, a small girl with glasses raised her hand and asked quietly, "Do you think he remembers you?" Emily smiled, blinking back the emotion rising in her chest. "I think he remembers someone helped," she replied. "And maybe that's enough." Summer settled softly over Whispering Pines Nature Reserve. The days stretched longer, and the trails filled with the sounds of rustling leaves, buzzing insects, and distant birdsong. Emily walked the perimeter like she always did, her steps familiar, her gaze trained on the little things. A broken twig here, a new paw print there. It had been nearly 2 months since Luna and Scout were released. Sometimes, when the wind moved just right or the forest went unusually still, Emily felt as though they were near. She knew it wasn't likely they had been released miles away, but the sense never left her. Maybe it wasn't about distance. Maybe it was just the way their story had rooted itself into everything. Back at the Wildlife Center, the Cubs Call program had grown faster than anyone anticipated. Schools signed up months in advance. Volunteers now helped build miniature trail models for students to explore. And a new corner of the Learning Center featured bobcat tracks embedded in plaster so children could compare their shoe size to a wildcat's. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the way people treated the land. Local hikers reported more responsible behavior on trails, less litter, more quiet observation. Trail cameras picked up increased wildlife activity, as if the forest itself had begun to trust again. New signs were posted around the reserve, featuring a simple phrase below a paw print symbol: "The Wild watches too." One morning, Emily received a call from a biologist working with the regional wildlife tracking program. A bobcat wearing a temporary tag had been spotted on one of their trail cameras. The footage was brief, less than a minute, but showed a young, healthy male with golden eyes and distinctive markings on his front leg. Scout, she watched the video 3 times. There was no mistaking him. He had grown, lean and strong, his movements quick and confident. He had paused only briefly in front of the camera, glancing directly at it before slipping back into the shadows. He was thriving. She printed out a still from the footage and pinned it to the wall in the staff lounge, next to the first photo of Scout curled beside Luna in the enclosure. Underneath it, she wrote, "Still watching, still wild." As the weeks turned to months, Scout's story remained a quiet current running beneath the center's daily work. New animals came in: owls with clipped wings, raccoons tangled in fishing, lion, fox kits separated from their dens. Each one mattered. Each one received care. But every so often, someone's staff or visitor would ask about the little bobcat who had once come asking for help. Emily would smile and tell them, "He's out there. Because of him, so much more is being done." Indeed, what started with one cub had rippled outward in ways no one expected. Grant applications were approved more easily. Public support had never been stronger. And most importantly, attitudes were changing. People no longer saw wildlife as something to fear or ignore, but as part of something shared. That autumn, a group of school children visited the reserve on a field trip. They gathered at the edge of the healing grove, now empty and overgrown. With new grass, their guide pointed to a small wooden plaque posted near the entrance. It read, "In honor of the wild that asked for help," and reminded us how to answer. One of the children, maybe 7 or 8 years old, reached down and touched the paw print carved into the stone. She didn't say anything. She just smiled, as if understanding something far bigger than the words could explain. Emily watched from a distance, her ranger hat in her hands. She had once thought of the cub's arrival as a once-in-a-lifetime moment. But now she realized it was more than that. It wasn't just a story about a mother and her cub. It was about what can happen when humans choose to listen, when we stop just looking at the wild and finally see it. And in that quiet, powerful space between worlds, something remarkable is born. Hope.